Okay, so we are here for chapter 3 to discuss federalism. Federalism is an idea that is very important to the United States and the way that we run our governments. So, what is federalism? Federalism is a form of government in which different levels of government act relatively autonomously and have the power to act directly on people within their jurisdiction. Typically, federalism involves a centralized federal government and any number of regional or subnational governments, such as states, territories, provinces, or any other subunit as designated by the nation's constitution. Within the United States, federalism refers to the national, which is our federal government, and the various states or territorial governments. So it's important to recognize, the way that our country was made is that each state has its own government. Yes, that's why we have states' rights. But at the state level, we also have a legislature, we have an executive and a Supreme Court. So we have a lot of the same things that we have at the federal level at the state level. They just deal with things specifically addressed to the state. In California, the legislature comprises of the state Senate and the state assembly. So we call it, the assembly instead of the House. So federalism courts the legislature. Within federal systems, national courts typically resolve disputes between subnational governments. So, guess what? If you get in a car accident on your way home from school, you can't file at the United States Supreme Court for relief, right? You'd have to file here at the Southwest Justice Center for that. Now, if you are suing another state, states can sue other states. If you're suing the federal government, you can go to federal court, right? You only have to know when we can go to state and federal courts. We also have, the subnational governments, which is the state governments. They have representation within the national legislature, Congress. This allows regional concerns to influence national law. I think of our two senators here in California, Feinstein and I think it's Padilla. They're from Sacramento and San Francisco areas that are very different than Riverside County. So we're lucky to have people like Ken Calvert or Mark Decano, various people at this, the federal level in the House that can actually speak up to what's needed in Riverside County. Okay. Okay, so then we have some alternatives to federalism. So we have this idea of a unitary system of government. Subnational governments depend heavily on the national government, and that the national government holds virtually all power except those powers granted to the subnational governments, by the central government. So that might almost seem a little bit like ours, but it is different. Then we have in the Confederate, it's different because we do have those two tracks of government running. In the Confederate systems, which remember before we were a country, we were a loose confederate of states. Most power is decentralized and possessed by the subnational governments, the states, and the central government power relies on the consent of the subnational government. So again, even your book says this was the first form we had in the United States. With a weak national government and strong governments, this did not work for us. So federalism and the Constitution. Several provisions of the U.S. Constitution define the powers of the national government and state governments. Others restrict the power of the national government and state governments to act within certain areas. So you're going to see, the whole idea of, reserved and enumerated powers that we learned about in the last lecture, that goes to federalism because of the fact that, certain things are provided for by certain elements of the government. So here's a great chart. So the federal government's, their enumerated powers is to coin money, regulate interstate and foreign commerce, conduct foreign affairs, establish immigration rules, punish counterfeiting. Counterfeiting is a federal crime. Establish copyright and patent laws, regulate the postal system, establish lower federal courts, so the Supreme Court, declare war, raise and support armies, And then you have this catch-all of make all laws necessary and proper to carry out responsibilities. So powers that are denied are to violate the Bill of Rights, change state boundaries, and tax state exports. Now, the state powers, the reserve powers, are to regulate intrastate commerce, so that's commerce within the state, conduct elections, provide for public health, safety, welfare, and morals, establish local governments, maintain the militia, which is our National Guard, and ratify amendments to the Constitution. So concurrently, what held by both is the power to levy and collect taxes. We got to pay state and federal taxes. Sucks. Borrow money, make and enforce laws. There's federal laws and there's state laws, right? Establish courts. We have California courts. That's typically where you go to jury duty. Charter banks and corporations, and then take property for public purposes with just compensation. That is known as eminent domain, and it's domain of the state and federal government. So this is an important chart for you to keep in mind. Some of the powers granted to Congress. So Article 1, Section 8 of our Constitution, and gives Congress the following powers: the power to collect taxes and duties, borrow money, coin money, establish national courts inferior to the Supreme Court, regulate interstate and foreign commerce, raise and support the armed forces, and declare war. This will be something that you're going to want to know for your exam. Then we have what's called the necessary and proper clause. And that says that Congress also has the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government. So this is kind of like the catch-all. It's the elastic clause. They call it the elastic clause because it can be made as big or as tight as possible. So, Congress gets this authority to act in furtherance of its enumerated powers, such as, when courts take a particularly broad view of the federal government to act under the Commerce Clause, which gives Congress the ability to, regulate interstate commerce. Then we have reserve powers of the states, and that is where the 10th Amendment comes in. If the Constitution does not give the states the rights to do certain things, if it's not a duty or a job of the federal government, it becomes a state's issue, because we've wanted a weaker federal government and a stronger state government. So the framers of the Constitution believed that the states possessed reserved powers, and that's anything that wasn't prohibited by the Constitution or delegated to the federal government belonged to the states. This is an important concept to know. So there are some restrictions in Article 1, Section 10 of the Constitution on state power. They restrict the power of the states to act with certain areas, including entering into treaties with foreign governments. California can't enter into a treaty with Mexico because we're so close, right? Coining money. We can't make our own money in California. Levying taxes on imports or exports, or suspending, the right of habeas corpus, passing bill of attainder or ex post facto laws. So what those are: habeas corpus, that is, when we take you to court to say, the state of court say, why are you holding me? Right? You can't detain somebody without having any kind of cause. So bills of attainder and ex post facto laws are laws that they punish prior acts by making something you did before the law was passed illegal. You can't do that. And then we have further restraints on state power. We get to look to the 14th Amendment that prohibits states from denying individuals rights granted to them under the U.S. Constitution. That is our idea of due process. Then the 15th, 19th, and 26th Amendments include important protections of the individual's civil rights, including a prohibition on state governments from abridging the right of citizens to vote based on race, sex, or age. Then we have this idea of the supremacy clause, right? It states that the Constitution, federal laws, and treaties are the supreme law of the land. Once you get up to the federal law, to the federal court, to the U.S. Supreme Court. There's nowhere else to go. If you don't like their decision, then you don't like their decision. That's you got to stand by it. Because under the Supremacy Clause, the Constitution, federal law and treaties prevail over a conflicting state law as long as the federal government was acting constitutionally. So you're never going to really win at the state level unless you can prove unconstitutional acts. So an interesting thing is the distribution of finances. How does our state governments work? I've always wondered because you hear that in a bank account, right? You can't have more than 250K, or else if the bank gets attacked or something happens to the bank, your money's not insured. So where does the state keep their money? I've always wondered, is there like one accountant at the state level who, has the ATM card for the state of California or what? So federal, state, and local governments rely primarily on taxation to raise revenue to fund the states. So the 16th Amendment authorized Congress to tax the income of individuals without apportioning it to the states on the basis of population. The federal government raised about half of its revenue from individual income taxes and about 1/3 from payroll taxes. How do states raise their revenue? State and local governments raise revenue through various taxes, including income taxes, property taxes, and sales taxes. So I said in the first lecture, sales tax and property taxes are super important for public safety. State government raise about half of their revenue through these various taxes. State governments receive about 30% of their revenue from federal grants, and local governments receive over 1/3 of their revenue from federal and state grants. So that's important too. Here's our federal budget in 2019, kind of the way it's chunked out. Our big ticket items are going to be Social Security, healthcare, health insurance programs, and defense. So there's a struggle between national and state powers. So in the early 1800s, several decisions by the U.S. Supreme Court greatly expanded the power of the national government through the court's expansive interpretation of the Elastic Clause, particularly as it applied to the power of Congress to regulate interstate commerce. One thing I want you guys to think about when we're dealing with the courts, and I wish you could see me, is that the courts, it's like a pendulum, right? The courts, sometimes they lean right, sometimes they lean left. Right now we're in a right-leaning court. Next week, you're going to learn about the Warren Court. And in the Warren Court, it leans very much so left. So it's kind of something to keep in mind. It's, when you add humans to it, it changes. So during the same period, states sought to curb the growing power of the national government by asserting that states had the power to nullify national laws that the state viewed as unconstitutional. Okay. So following the end of Reconstruction, so that's after the Civil War era, the U.S. entered a period known as dual federalism. And that's where, the federal and the state governments act with distinct areas of jurisdiction. During the Great Depression, this actually changed into cooperative federalism. So, and that's when the national and state governments coordinate their efforts to address problems, which makes sense with the economy, right? Think about our economy today. I also, implore you guys to think about the people of Hawaii who, on Maui, just saw devastation. We would prefer probably a level of cooperative federalism where the states and the federal government goes to help. Example of the cooperative federalism is when during the pandemic, I worked for the Small Business Administration. So they're used to servicing different areas of the country after a hurricane, right, or some local national disaster. But they had to work with state and federal governments to help businesses get back on their feet after COVID. So it was an important thing. So during this period of the Great Depression, right, the federal government expanded its power in economic regulations, civil rights protections, the creation of social welfare programs. We saw Social Security and disability that was part of the New Deal. So a lot of social programs came out of the Depression. Here's an example of a soup kitchen in 1931. I implore you guys, and I like to show this stuff to you guys. simply because our economy is getting worse and worse. Hopefully we don't end up in this kind of situation. But I would be interested in hearing your guys' opinions on this simply because, you know, what's going to happen anymore after 2020? Things got kind of weird. So then we have these two examples to show you. Dual federalism is also known as layered cake federalism, where programs and authorities are clearly divided. So you have your different layers of cake. And then cooperative federalism, where we all work together, is a marble cake because everything's mixed. So now we have new federalism. So you're going to want to know the different types of federalism for your exam. In the early 1970s, President Nixon attempted to restore state power in certain areas where the power of the government had grown during the period of cooperative federalism. Then in the 80s, you had Reagan continuing this implementation of new federalism by decentralizing national power, increasing revenue sharing with state and local governments, and giving greater discretion to state and local governments over spending federal grants. So this idea of new federalism, right, is kind of taking away the big government. And one thing you'll know is like Reagan, right? Reagan was a Republican. So Republicans do believe in, not having the federal government do so much. They want smaller federal government and bigger state government. So we have intergovernmental relationships. This is something that's important, right? So the federal government may compel state governments to act in the national interest by offering incentives to the states in the form of intergovernmental grants. So, on the other side, the federal government may mandate state action in other areas without the provision of federal grants. In fact, the federal government can give financial penalties for noncompliance with these unfunded mandates. So a lot of this is considered like the carrot and the stick approach. So if they want safer highways, right, then a state, they'll dangle money in front of the state and say, hey, if you give us safer highways, we'll fund this project, right? They can work together. And then we have the idea of grants, right? You guys should all know what grants are. Being college students, you want grants and not loans, right? Because grants you don't have to pay back. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the federal government often used land grants to promote state action in certain areas. Many state universities exist because of federal land grants that promoted higher education. Since the late 19th century, though, these grants have been used as cash grants to prompt state and local governments to do certain things. So there's some different types of grants. There's categorical grants that contain more restrictions on the grant recipient's discretion to use the funds. And there's block grants that allow greater discretion by the recipient because they come with fewer conditions. So there's always going to be some kind of oversight with these grants, right? Because if the government's giving you money to, make a low-income housing neighborhood, they want to make sure you do it and not just take the money and pocket it, right? Then we have this idea of unfunded mandates, and those are federal laws or regulations that require the state or local governments to undertake certain obligations without the federal government providing, full compensation to comply. So, they use this concept for local action on education, environmental protection, civil rights protection in the homeland. An example I do kind of want to bring up, I mentioned in one of the other lectures, is the school board in Temecula. So the school board in Temecula wanted to stop using certain textbooks based on the portrayal of U.S. history. Well, Governor Newsom got involved and said that if they don't start using the books that the state wants them to use, they were going to fine the school district like $1 million. Kind of ridiculous, but and that right there could be an example of an unfunded mandate because just at the state, between the state and local level, because they're going to fill it in their pocketbooks, right? Then we have contested issues. So Federal and state policy does not always align. Think about marijuana. Marijuana has been legal in California, especially medicinal marijuana. It is still a crime federally. Immigration, right? We are supposed to have immigration laws, but studies have shown that, if immigrants are a part of your community and something happens where they need to seek police services or they need assistance, if they know that the police are just going to deport them, they're not going to seek help. So a lot of places they have rules where you can't call immigration to even intervene um, on these things. And then same-sex marriage, initially it was certainly certain states where um, same-sex couples were allowed to marry, but now it's gone federal. So strategizing about new issues, right? We have interest groups. So interest groups are groups that align based on, you know, common identity interests. So it can be, a Republican group, it can be a women's group, it can be a anti-gun group, it can be BLM, it can be, right, just different groups that want to shift policy. And they want to do national and state policy, right? You want your policy to be accepted. So each group must carefully plan their strategy on how to achieve its goals. I know I was even thinking about running for office because I was frustrated. And I even figured out, I was like, oh, I'm going to run for the House of Representatives. But realistically, the state is where we have the ability to do the most, and make the most difference. So we do have benefits of federalism, though. It encourages, innovative approaches to social and economic policy. The citizens of one state may choose to pursue a certain policy, which may later serve as a model for other states or the national government to follow. States have led the way on numerous issues, including granting women the right to vote, promoting environmental protection, and improving health insurance. So the states and the feds working together have been great. We do have some drawbacks, though, and that's disparities in education, environmental protection, income, and healthcare. I know someone who her grandkids go to school in LA, and she's very much aware that the lower income school in the highly African American neighborhood she lives in is likely, they don't have the programs that the other schools do in the area. And those other schools are the more white, more affluent schools. So she wants to get a doctorate degree so she can go and she can help fight. So there may be multiple levels of bureaucracy within the federal system that can cause problems. So we'll actually talk about bureaucracy in another lecture, I believe. So, okay. That was our chapter 3 lecture. Thank you so much.